I'm ITV's Judge Rinder. I've been a criminal barrister for over a decade. I'm going to be examining cases that have shocked the nation.
On today's episode, we take a look at the life and crimes of one of Britain's most notorious criminals. His involvement in the largest gold bullion robbery this country has ever seen.
The robbery of gold bullion and jewels worth £26 million was Britain's biggest and most violent.
They cut around the crutch area and then they just poured the petrol down. If we don't get what we want, I put a match to him and I believed every word of it.
Those criminals went in for £3 million and walked out with £26 million.
When undercover operations...
The plan was 2 undercover officers would climb over the fence and watch where Noye went.
Turned to tragedy.
Noye stabbed this undercover policeman 14 times.
And a heartbreaking murder.
He's got a knife, he's got a knife. Stephen turns round and he's then stabbed.
Leading to an international manhunt.
We're getting tips from everywhere, sightings of Noye, everywhere from China to Russia to Cyprus to Spain to America, you name it.
People said to me, you want revenge? I said, I don't want revenge. I want justice.
This is Judge Rinder's crime stories.
Every year on our roads, thousands of people end up as the victims of violent attacks. On the 19th of May, 1996, Stephen Cameron, a 21-year-old, fell prey to a frenzied stabbing in an act of road rage so violent that it left him with multiple stab wounds. By the time the ambulances arrived, he had died. What followed was a manhunt for a killer who had fled the scene, and as it turned out, was one of the most infamous criminals in the United Kingdom. Kent, known as the Garden of England, a picturesque county on the southeast coast. 21-year-old Stephen Cameron, an electrical engineer, lived here with his father Ken and mother Tony.
It wasn't just my son, he was a mate. We used to play golf together, we used to go to snooker, to have a pint. You know, we spent a lot of time together. Stephen used to torment the life out of me. He was full of fun. He never, ever stopped.
Stephen had recently got engaged to 17-year-old Danielle. In love, the couple were excited for their future and what it would hold.
They'd been together 3 or 4 years. Danielle actually lived with us. Oh, they spent every hour together. Stephen loved her to bits.
The 19th of May, 1996 was a day like any other. The newly engaged couple left their home for an afternoon out. The decision was made by Stephen to take his van and have Danielle drive.
Stephen Cameron had asked Danielle, who was only 17 at the time and only just passed her driving test, to drive his van on the motorway, and she is pleading with him, can I just drive my car, because I'm not used to driving your van and I've never driven on a motorway.
Danielle reluctantly agreed to drive. They set off towards their destination. Also on the road was another man, driving a Land Rover, and he was heading in the same direction. Both vehicles were nearing the Swanley interchange of the M25. It would be here that their lives would change forever.
So she was rather worried, had probably driven onto the motorway in an over-cautious manner and cut up the Land Rover Discovery driver, who then pulled up in front of her. And it was then that Stephen, who's in the passenger seat, either gesticulated or indicated to the driver that he was rather silly. And the gesticulation obviously annoyed the driver. He got out and there's a confrontation between Stephen and the man in the front of the van. Danielle sees it all.
The confrontation rapidly spiraled out of control. What started as an argument became a violent brawl.
Stephen was a strong boy, big strong boy, and Stephen gave him a really good hiding.
The man decided that the fight was not over and returned to his vehicle. He marched towards Stephen. This time, he wasn't empty-handed.
Danielle is screaming, he's got a knife, he's got a knife. Stephen turns round and he's then stabbed twice.
walked away with a smirk on his face. Piece of dirt. And got in his car and drove off. Danielle was hysterical. She was screaming, crying. And I said, "Whereabouts are you?" She said, "We're on the roundabout," which is only 2 minutes from our house. And I got there and I just looked at Danielle and she was as white as a sheet. She was snow white. And I got her in the car, then I walked over to Stephen. He was just laying there as white as anything, and he was just, I just knew he was dead. Ambulance people had stopped and they was trying to work on him, but I just knew he was dead.
Stephen was taken to the nearest hospital. Ken and his wife Tony followed to say their final goodbyes.
They were so kind, and they took us through to see Stephen's body and say goodbye to him. It's the worst day of your life.
On the 19th of May 1996, aged only 21, Stephen Cameron had passed away. Police were now on the hunt for the killer.
I found out there'd been an incident described by the media as a road rage incident.
Stephen, a 21-year-old electrical engineer, was murdered in front of his fiancée at the Swanley interchange. He was stabbed twice after a heated argument with the driver of a Land Rover Discovery. The killer is still at large.
My immediate reaction was to ring the incident room, find out if they needed me in, but the duty superintendent was confident at that time perhaps that they'd got the registration number of the vehicle involved, and it would only be a matter of time perhaps before someone was arrested and the matter was then brought to court.
However, it would soon become clear to officers that their confidence was perhaps misplaced.
There were 30-odd witnesses, but no one got the registration number of the vehicle. The only person at the scene who had the presence of mind to even think about that was Stephen. We know that because he's saying to Danielle, "Get the number, get the number."
Understandably, in her state of shock, Stephen's girlfriend couldn't retain the full registration number. Police had only the first letter of the registration plate.
I think there were 18,000 L-registered Land Rover Discoveries in the UK on the police national computer. So, needle in a haystack, that's how difficult it was initially. And of course, without the full number, we were sending officers all over the country to try and trace what we thought might be the registered owner or the vehicle.
Investigating officers would spend the following week searching through databases. Remarkably, the police found a name they recognised, registered to an L-plate Land Rover.
We then soon found that one of the vehicles that was on the database was registered in Bridge and Road, Bexley.
The Land Rover was registered in a false name to an Anthony Francis at that address.
And that was an alias that Kenneth Noye used to use.
Kenneth Noye was a name the police knew only too well.
A couple of days after Stephen had died, the police came round and said to me, "Have you ever heard of Kenneth Noye?" And I said, "Yes, I have. I've actually read a book about him, and so's Stephen." He said, "Well, he's come into the frame, and that's who we're looking for." I couldn't honestly believe it. Shook me to my boots.
The police now had their prime suspect, Kenneth Noye. Noye was a career criminal known to the authorities for over 30 years. And to fully understand the man in question, let's go back to 1983 and what was the biggest gold bullion robbery of all time. Coming up.
The robbery of gold bullion and jewels worth £26 million was Britain's biggest and most violent.
They cut around the crutch area and then they just poured the petrol down. If we don't get what we want, I put a match to him and I believed every word of it.
21-year-old Stephen Cameron had been murdered. After hundreds of man-hours searching for the suspected murderer, they had found a name: Kenneth Noye. Noye had hit the headlines in 1983 as he had participated in the largest gold bullion robbery in British criminal history, the Brinks-Mat robbery. The robbery had always been of interest to journalists and authors alike. Wensley Clarkson had written about Kenneth Noye and the robbery.
The Brinks-Mat warehouse was a storage facility for valuables such as gold and often cash, which was going in transit from one country to another via Heathrow Airport. What would happen was the plane would come in, unload the gold, the cash, or whatever it is. It would then be stored in this supposedly high-security warehouse.
Mike Scouse was a security supervisor on shift at the time.
It was an average day. I didn't notice any vehicles hanging around. So after I let the lads in, they went upstairs into the crew room. One was making the tea, one was getting the books and keys ready.
The guards waited for the last member of the team to arrive before starting their shift. Detective Superintendent Ian Brown was part of the investigation following the robbery.
The inside man was a brother-in-law, basically, of one of the robbers. He'd been talked to over a period of a month or two and persuaded to give information, and also to let the criminals in to the vaults at the right time. He came the night before the robbery and said that in the vaults at that particular time there was something like £3 million worth of diamonds, cash. The plan was that he would, the following morning, arrive at work. He would leave the front door open and the villains would come in and clear the vault out of the £3 million. On that particular morning, he arrived late, about 10 minutes late. He went up, had a cup of tea, told his workmates that he'd had a bad curry the night before and he got stomachache and he needed to use the toilet. So he went downstairs, allegedly to use the toilet, opened the front door and left it on the latch, and went back upstairs. Sat down again for his cup of tea, and after a couple of minutes, in came 6 masked men.
All of a sudden, all hell broke loose. There's tables and chairs being kicked over. There's this man wearing a balaclava running at me with a semi-automatic pistol in his hand. The next minute, I'm on the floor, got a good kicking. I was handcuffed, hooded.
The Brinks-Mat robbery itself was renowned because of the violent threats that were carried out by the robbers.
They cut round the crutch area and then they just poured the petrol down. Of course, it went everywhere. And petrol burns.
The criminals were organised. The vaults were full of valuables, and they knew it. Fearing for their lives, the guards could do nothing but comply.
I was downstairs with a gun at my head that said to me, if we don't get what we want, if the alarms go off, the police turn up, I'll put a match to you and put a bullet through the back of your head. And I believed every word of it. I'd no other reason not to.
Criminals went in and they stole exactly what they went in for. As they turned to go out, they noticed boxes on the floor. Opening one of them, they found them full of gold bars. They didn't know they were there. They had no reason to think they were there. But those criminals went in for £3 million and walked out with £26 million worth of solid gold bars. 999 proof, that's 24 karat gold.
The robbery of gold bullion and jewels worth £26 million from the Brinks-Mat vaults at Heathrow Airport on November the 26th, 1983, was Britain's biggest and most violent.
The gang had successfully got away with £26 million worth of gold. But how would the criminals convert that gold into cash?
Kenneth Noye got involved with the Brinks-Mat robbery not because he carried it out, but because he was a person who could transfer and transform this gold into cash.
What happened was that in order to change the gold to a saleable product, It was necessary to put something in it to make sure it wasn't 24-carat gold. So it needed to be smelting.
Noye and another man were the men in charge of smelting down the gold and then representing it in a different shape so it could then be converted into cash.
Noye came up with a plan. He would assume a fake identity, a false name that he would use on tickets and official documents. Then he would travel to the Channel Islands with the gold.
A gentleman by the name of Mr. Swan had gone over to Jersey. He'd gone into a jeweller's in Jersey and ordered 11 bars of gold, 999% pure. He wanted them exactly to the specification of the stuff that had been stolen from the Brinks-Mat gold bullion robbery. He ordered them, he was going to pay cash, and he would come back to collect them. This information had been passed to Scotland Yard. The police out in Jersey had made further inquiries, and they found that Mr. Swan was in actual fact Kenneth Noye. He was stopped and questioned by the police out there, and he said, well, I just got a ticket of a friend who wasn't using it. I didn't know I'd committed an offence. I'm ever so sorry. And they let him go. They watched him when he came back again for the second time. He went to the jeweller's and he picked up his 11 bars of gold. He walked straight round the corner and put them into a safety deposit box. What Kenneth Noye did, in actual fact, was he walked out of Jersey with a piece of paper. And that piece of paper said, I am the legitimate owner of 11 bars of pure gold. Now he was in a position where he could drive around anywhere in the country with 11 bars of gold and prove that he was the legitimate owner of them. He was untouchable.
Once Noye's name came into the frame when it came to the smelting of the gold, the police cranked up their surveillance operation and they started to watch him 24 hours a day and anyone associated with him.
26th of January 1985. The police knew that the gold was being moved from one place to another. Undercover officers waited at Noye's home for the courier to arrive. Brian Reeder was that courier.
The plan was that when Reeder came in, 2 undercover officers would climb over the fence, get as close to Kenneth Noye's house as they could, and watch where Noye went to get his gold. If he didn't get it from the house, the plan was to bug his car and follow it at a later stage to see where he went to pick up the gold. Unfortunately, everything went wrong.
Just minutes after Noye and his criminal associate, Brian Reeder, met up at Hollywood Cottage, Noye's dogs started to make a hell of a racket. This immediately alerted Noye to the fact there might be somebody on the property.
The dogs went wild. They ran into the woods and started barking.
Dogs are out. Dogs are out.
Noye rushed back into the kitchen, picked up a kitchen knife, came out with a kitchen knife and a torch, and went into the woods. 2 officers had been told, get out if there's any trouble. One of them turned and went, said, come on, John, to his friend, John Fordham. He ran and jumped over the fence. He turned back and John Fordham wasn't with him.
One officer had managed to flee. The other was now alone.
Noye then attacked him on the pretext that he wanted to know who he was and on the pretext that he didn't know why this person was in his garden. During the scuffle that then ensued between Noye and this man, Noye stabbed this undercover policeman 14 times. The officer died almost instantly, and in that moment, this investigation into a lot of stolen gold turned into a murder inquiry.
At that moment, the gold is unimportant. We now have the murder of a police officer. John Fordham was a very, very well-respected police officer. He was highly trained. He'd been trained by the SAS. He was a lovely guy. He was sadly missed. He's a man who was so well-respected, he'll never be forgotten.
Kenneth Noye was taken into custody for killing Detective Constable John Fordham. Police now had the opportunity to search Noye's property and to prove that he was a key player in the Brinks-Mat gold bullion heist. The authorities were building a case against Kenneth Noye that they hoped would send him to prison.
for life. Coming up.
Kenneth Noye promised every piece of information in relation to the gold bullion if he could be allowed to plead guilty to the manslaughter of John Fordham. Not acceptable.
Earlier, police investigating the murder of Stephen Cameron were looking for a man, Kenneth Noye. In order to understand the murderer they were hunting, let's take a look at his dark and troubling past. On the 26th of January 1985, Kenneth Noye had attacked and killed undercover police officer John Fordham. He'd been stabbed 14 times.
Noye is hauled into custody. Noye pleads his innocence. He said he had no idea who this man was in his garden, and his reaction was perfectly natural.
A meticulous search began as police were desperate to find evidence linking Noye to the gold bullion robbery.
Day after the murder, the grounds in Kenneth Noye's house were searched.
Peter Holloway, a sergeant for Kent Police, was one of the team given the task of searching the home of Kenneth Noye.
When we arrived, we were told that we were required to search the outside of the house for evidence. And I recall at the time, it was a fairly vague brief, especially as we understood that a knife that was potentially used in the death of DC Fordham had already been found. So we weren't really clear on what we were actually looking for.
Despite their every effort, no evidence was found. As the hours passed and the first day of searching was coming to a close, Peter noticed something unusual.
By sheer coincidence, as I crossed the terrace, I just looked back and in the distance, way over the other side of the terrace, I saw one of the slabs, which was slightly raised. I decided to lift it up, expecting there to be maybe there was some drainage work going on or something like that. And as I lifted the slab, I could see a paint tin. In the bottom of a hole was red and white gingham check, small cloth folded up. And as I opened it up, I remember the brightness of the gold. It was quite amazing, you know. I think my jaw must have hit the floor.
After further searching, officers found 11 gold bars. They now had enough evidence to charge him in connection to the robbery. This, combined with a murder charge, ensured that this criminal would be spending a long time behind bars. Ian Brown witnessed an interview with Noye prior to his trial.
I sat there and listened to the two of them talking. And Kenneth Noye squirmed and wriggled and promised to give every piece of information in relation to the gold bullion if only he could be allowed to plead guilty to the manslaughter of John Fordham. Not acceptable, because we knew that he was going to be found guilty of murder.
In December 1985, Kenneth Noye stood trial at the Old Bailey for the murder of John Fordham. He claimed he had acted in self-defense.
His statement was that he was frightened. He found this man in the woods. This man was threatening both him and his family. He defended himself in such a way that he was stabbing him in a frenzy and didn't realise what he was doing. Because he had made this plea, it could no longer be manslaughter. He openly admitted that he intended to do what he did, but it was in self-defense.
To support his claim, Kenneth Noye's legal team would use an unusual tactic.
The pivotal moment in the trial came when Noye's defence barrister convinced the judge to agree to go down to the scene, Hollywood Cottage, with the jury and examine the circumstances and the location in terms of what it would have been like for Noye in the middle of the night to be confronted by this man dressed in black.
Having heard arguments both from the prosecution and the defense, the jury had come to a decision.
Much to the amazement of the police and the prosecution, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict.
He was extremely happy. He winked at some of the jury members and then thanked them all profusely.
He was the first man in British history to walk away from the Old Bailey, having been charged with murdering a police officer.
Kenneth Noye was not off the hook yet, however. In July 1986, he would again face a jury. He'd been charged with conspiracy to handle the Brinks-Mat gold bullion and VAT fraud.
During Noye's second trial at the Old Bailey, he was smiling and winking at the jury, just as he had done in the first one.
Peter, having found the gold on Noye's estate, was called to give evidence at the trial.
There was some joviality there, and I feel that I'd walked in shortly after something had amused the jury and the judge. And it was clear that Noye, who appeared a very charming man, had engaged the jury in some way. My recollection of Noye in court was of a very smartly dressed individual who was clearly intent on engaging the jury.
This time, however, the jury's verdict would differ drastically.
This time, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 14 years. Kenneth Noye stood up and addressed the jury. And this time he addressed them by telling them that he hoped they all died of cancer.
Noye had been sentenced to 14 years behind bars for conspiracy to handle the gold bullion and VAT fraud. He served 7 of his 14-year sentence. Unbelievably, he had only been out of prison for 2 years when he murdered Stephen Cameron. The police were now in pursuit of the criminal.
He disappeared from his home in Sevenoaks, and we had no idea where he was, and indeed, making inquiries of his friends and families, neither did they, according to them. But he'd certainly been about up to and including the 19th of May.
At this time, Nick Biddis needed to keep the name of Kenneth Noye out of the media. Despite his efforts, Nick was contacted by the press in regards to who they were investigating and their connection to the Stephen Cameron murder.
If you're going to get a phone call from one of the Sunday papers on a Friday afternoon, they've probably already printed the story, so they're just looking for a quote. The reporter said, is it right you're after Kenneth Noye in respect to the M25? And all I said was, it's not my policy to discuss anyone who I might be seeking, so if you would kindly not print that, that would be very helpful. They said, well, we are going to print it and it'll be in the Sunday papers. And sure enough, within 36 hours, it's plastered all over the front page.
I was astounded when I picked up a paper on a Sunday morning and there was the story naming Kenneth Noye as the #1 suspect in the road rage murder. His temper got the better of him, and now he found himself the most wanted man probably in Europe, if not the world.
There was a silver lining to that cloud, of course, because it did keep people's awareness of the crime. It kept the inquiry fairly active a long time after the event.
Kenneth Noye was a wanted man. The police would work around the clock, desperate to capture the killer.
For the police, having now named Kenneth Noye as #1 suspect, it turned into a logistical nightmare. They were getting tips from everywhere, sightings of Noye, everywhere from China to Russia, to Cyprus, to Spain, to America, you name it.
Nick Biddis was determined to get Stephen justice. He really was. And I'm so grateful to him for doing it. People said to me, you want revenge? I said, I don't want revenge. I want justice. I want the person who took my son from us to pay the price, put in prison.
As the months passed and the lead started to dwindle, the public and Stephen's family began to doubt whether Noye would ever be caught.
Gospel truth, I didn't ever think they would catch him. I didn't. With his contacts, the money that he had, I thought he was gone forever.
Critical details of the investigation were being leaked to the press. Nick Biddis would limit other officers' involvement in the case.
I ran the latter part of this operation from home. And the reason I did that was because I knew that there was some leaks somewhere. It seemed that every time I was doing anything, as it were, through official channels, through Interpol, through Travel Bureau, anything like that, the press seemed to find out fairly soon afterwards. So my wife probably had more knowledge about what I was doing than some of the officers who perhaps under routine circumstances should have known.
In 1998, Nick received intelligence from an officer, a possible sighting of Noye in Spain.
We'd sort of thought, well, this has got to be worth following up. And within a few weeks, I sent the officers out there. Rang up and said, Governor, we've just seen him and it's Kenneth Noye. That was a eureka moment for me.
Identifying Noye was one thing. Bringing him back to the UK was another.
Having established where Noye was, the police's next problem was being absolutely certain that the only witness to the Cameron killing, which was Cameron's girlfriend, Daniel Cable, could actually identify Noye.
I said, Daniel, one day I'm going to come to you and I may well need you to get on a plane and go somewhere.
That day had finally arrived.
Tomorrow, you're going with an ID officer. I can't tell you where you're going, but you'll need a suitcase and your passport.
The police mounted a unique operation.
Obviously, the danger with taking a witness out to Spain with absolute minimum backup. Let's not forget, when the Brinks-Mat inquiry was fully underway, John Fordham was stabbed to death by Kenneth Noye. They had the backup of a full team on their home ground, so to speak.
Nick knew only too well how dangerous this could be for Danielle, but this was a risk he had to take.
Now, in my experience, undercover police operations are extremely dangerous and risky. Decisions to send officers and witnesses undercover are not made lightly, but with care and with complex legal oversight. After lengthy consideration here, Nick Biddis made the decision to send Danielle and an undercover officer abroad to identify the man who had murdered her fiancé. They were both aware of the risks to their own life if they got caught, but were prepared to do anything in order to ensure that Noye would finally face justice.
Coming up.
It was an astonishing police operation.
No indication that she'd recognised anybody. And then after another glance, she looked to the right.
Earlier, Nick Biddis had received intelligence on Kenneth Noye's location. Police were now hot on the trail of Britain's most wanted man. In order to bring him back to the UK, he had to be positively identified as the killer of Stephen Cameron. The only person able to do this was Stephen's fiancée, Danielle.
Until we had firm evidence that the person who'd stabbed Stephen Cameron on the 19th of May was indeed Kenneth Noye, we couldn't get an arrest warrant. It had to be what they call court ready. In other words, he has been identified by one of the key witnesses.
Danielle was to travel with an identification officer to Spain. This officer has chosen to stay anonymous.
This was totally new. It was fraught with danger. And of course, the aggravation factor was that not only had I got to carry out an ID parade, but I was taking a young lady, a civilian witness, out with us, and her welfare and safety would be paramount as well, for obvious reasons. We had to do that identification procedure, get in and get out, without alerting Kenny Noye that we were there or we had seen him. I was going to ask her to see whether she could identify the person that had stabbed her fiancé. My concern was how she would react.
We knew Danielle had been taken off somewhere, but we didn't know where, and we knew something was brewing.
It was an astonishing police operation. They'd taken this girl who'd witnessed this man, Kenneth Noye, killing her own fiancé, and they took her out to get her to confirm that, yes, this was the man.
We needed a group environment, and what I was considering was a restaurant somewhere.
Undercover officers had been tracking Noye for days. Then, the opportunity they'd been waiting for materialized.
I did tell her there was a risk, but we would have backup outside at the edge of the car park. But that was all. A very resolved young lady, Danielle. She never complained, always enthusiastic, always obliging, cooperative. We walked to the restaurant and walked into the main dining hall of the restaurant. I'd asked her, as we was going in, to just cast her eyes around gradually, try not to make out that she was looking for anybody in particular. We went through the main restaurant to an ante-room. She looked through, and at first there was no indication that she'd recognised anybody. And then after another glance, she looked to the right. You could immediately see her face drop. You know, tears came to her eyes. I asked her, had she seen anybody she could identify? And she replied, yes, she had. I went and looked to where she had indicated, and yes, it was Kenny Noye sitting there. Danielle was getting quite distressed at that time, and of course we had to get her out of there before it drew attention to the fact that we had a young distressed lady with us. But of course we then had to walk past Noye's back, so we casually walked out, hoping that he wouldn't turn around, and he didn't. Once back at the hotel, I sat down and drafted out a report, plus my statement. They had to be placed before the head of the CPS in the morning.
After being positively identified, the CPS gave permission to arrest Noye. Nick put his plan into motion.
We had a fair idea that he would be going out, probably into a local restaurant, which he happened to do the following night. I was kept up to date as things were actually progressing. Only the Spanish police could actually arrest him, physically arrest him. And of course, they, having been told that this man had already killed a police officer, albeit claiming self-defence, with a knife. And then he killed a 21-year-old innocent young man at the roadside with a knife, sitting in a restaurant, holding a knife, eating his dinner. The Spanish police were taking no chances with him. I suspect there was not much chance of him struggling, but he was certainly restrained and certainly knew he was under arrest.
On Friday the 28th of August 1998, Noye was finally arrested.
Kent Police have been in liaison with the Crown Prosecution Service during the past few weeks, and with the assistance of Interpol, this arrest has been effected. A formal request for extradition of Kenneth Noye will be sent through diplomatic channels to the government of Spain.
Tony phoned me and said, "I've had a phone call from Nick. They've got him." I said, "You what?" Oh, God. Cried my eyes out. That's just at last. Nick made sure that we knew first, which is the right thing, isn't it? I don't want to read it in the paper that he's been caught.
Kenneth Noye, however, was determined not to return to the UK.
Noye wouldn't go easily. He was detained in a prison in Spain, awaiting extradition, and during that period, he tried everything in his power, through his lawyers, to fight that extradition.
After a 2-year extradition battle, Noye was deported back to the UK, and on the 29th of March 2000, his trial began. For the second time in his life, he was in the dock of the Old Bailey, accused of murder.
Kenneth Noye found himself in court accused of stabbing another man to death. And for the second time, Noye also claimed self-defense.
He said he thought Stephen was going to pick him up and chuck him over the bridge. What a silly thing to say. He said, and I had to defend myself, and the only way I could defend myself was stab him. But my argument is, when they stopped fighting, him and Stephen, and he walked back to the Land Rover Discovery, why didn't he get in and drive off? Why did you have to get a knife and come back and stab him? If he was frightened, why didn't he drive off? He had the chance to, didn't he? We were sat in the court itself, and he tried to get us chucked out of the court because of we could influence the jury, he said, being upset and crying and God knows what else, you know. And the clerk of the court said, "This is my court, and I say who sits where. Go away."
It was suspected that throughout the trial, Noye was attempting to manipulate the jury. The contrast between Kenneth Noye's 2000 and the one that stood before the jury in 1986 did not go unnoticed.
Instead of being the smart, very fit-looking individual that we all knew he was, Noye slumped his shoulders, wore a cardigan, and sounded like a bumbling elderly man when he gave evidence in court.
Dressed as an old man, little old frail old man. Yeah, right.
Danielle giving evidence was without doubt the pivotal moment of this trial. An essential witness in the case, she had the heartbreaking task of describing, in detail, the murder of her fiancé, Stephen Cameron.
I will always be grateful for Danielle. I will, honestly. She was like a daughter to me, anyway. And to Tony. She really was. We were all so close, the four of us.
After giving her testimony, Danielle would go on to change her identity and move away from the area. Nobody involved in the case would forget her bravery. The trial had come to a close once again. As in 1986, the jury were left to deliberate. Would Noye be found guilty of murder, or would his attempts to fool the jury succeed?
Juries can be so fickle at times. You never know until that verdict is announced.
There was definitely a feeling that Noye thought he was going to get acquitted again.
On the 14th of April 2000, the jury had come to a unanimous decision. Kenneth Noye was found guilty of murder. He was given a life sentence and told to serve a minimum of 16 years.
When the head juror stood up and said guilty, I shouted out, yes, and jumped up. And the Kent, two policemen beside of me, sat me back down. But I jumped up, yes. I was so elated. I was so, oh, yes. And his face was a picture.
This time, having been found guilty of murdering Stephen Cameron, Noye didn't curse the jury. He actually remained expressionless. It was almost as if he'd given up.
I was in court and I was standing not too far away from Ken and Tony Cameron, Stephen's mum and dad, who were, to say overjoyed, were very pleased with the result, very pleased with the result. And that evening I had a drink with them.
I think the conviction of Kenneth Noye and his sentence to life imprisonment helped to perhaps give John Fordham, as well as Stephen Cameron, a little bit of justice. I think everybody concerned in both cases thought that justice had been served.
Sadly, in April 2016, Stephen's mother Tony passed away. Her wish was that Ken continued the campaign, keeping her son's killer in prison.
She wanted him to come out of prison in a wooden box. She hated him with a vengeance. And all the appeals and everything we'd done was all driven by Tony. Really was. She was determined to keep him in prison. He's got no regard for life whatsoever. I think he's an evil man. He should die in prison. And hopefully he will do.
Kenneth Noye received a degree of notoriety. He certainly doesn't deserve this. He's nothing more than a dangerous and violent criminal. He's not worthy of any kind of celebrity. His associate Brian Reeder, who was present at the time of the John Fordham killing, hit the headlines recently as it turned out he was a mastermind behind the Hatton Garden robbery in April 2015. Choosing this criminal path has so far cost Kenneth Noye 24 years in prison.